Hi guys, it's Villain Theory, and today I'm talking all about setup and bonus modulars, how to use them, and let's start with what they are. So a setup modular, in my opinion, is a modular set which has a card with the setup keyword, which as you can see, Hope has it here, Telepathy has it, the Savage Land has it, and what it means is basically it starts the game in play. So when you get to turn 1, you're playing your first cards of the game. These cards are already in play on the board. So if Hope Summer's modular set is included, you have her under your control as the first player. If you have Telepathy included as a mod set, then the villain will have the telepathy attachment from the very start. And this is really cool because you can use it to make scenarios easier or harder from the very beginning of the game with perfect consistency, with very meaningful effects, which is awesome. The way I like to describe some of the harder setup modulars in this game is a little bit like sort of bridging the gap between difficulties. Standard with telepathy is probably going to be easier than playing on expert. All in all, they're just fantastic ways to change up the difficulty. Bonus modulars can also be setup modulars, but what I mean by bonus modular is if when constructing the scenario and it says, oh, you should have one modular set, and I recommend, I don't know, let's say it's Claw and it recommends Masters of Evil, that'd be your one normal modular set. And you can put in additional ones, and that's fine, but I would not count these. I do not think bonus modulars really should be considered to be full modular sets. They're just kind of extras you can throw into the encounter deck. They normally have anywhere between, let's say, 1 to 4 encounter cards, very small, and generally the effects aren't too disruptive on the encounter deck. An example here on the screen is Hope Summers. Her modular set is comprised of 2 cards. One always starts on the board, so you're just adding 1 card to the encounter deck. Do not go through scenario setup choosing Hope Summers as your modular set, and that is your only modular set, because you just added 1 card to the deck rather than, the average of 7 or 8. So be a little bit careful with that. But it also means you can just sort of sneak these in as extras and get these really cool effects. Let's start with how to make scenarios easier using these and then progress to how to make them harder. The 2 main setup modular sets to make the game easier are Hope Summers and Ship Command. Hope Summers is an ally who doesn't take consequential damage and mirrors your stats. So if I'm playing Captain America and I've got 2 in attack and 2 in forwarding, and I'm in control of Hope Summers as the first player, she moves between players, she's going to have 2 forward and 2 attack because I do, and that's really cool. And due to that lack of consequential damage, the long story short is that including the Hope Summers mod set gives you 2 more forwarding or 2 more attack than you would have otherwise had. And that's pretty powerful, very flexible, but you can take this further because of the traits she has. Because she's an ally, you can put on a bunch of attachments and things that power her up and then ready her up. And the readying is especially good because she doesn't take consequential damage, so you can really dominate scenarios if you lean into her. And if you don't lean into building around her, she's still just really good to include to give you that little bit of a boost. The Milano from Ship Command is very similar. The first player controls it, it moves around, so on and so forth. And whereas exhausting Hope Summers, using her stats would be, roughly 2 forwarding, 2 attack, will vary depending on your hero. The Milano is always just going to generate you a wild resource. In many ways, Hope Summers is a little bit more powerful than that, but it will depend on the character. For example, Jubilee, Venom, Miles Morales, Spider-Man, they all really like having wild resources, so this is kind of interesting. However, a bit like Hope Summers, you could build into her and do more that way. Well, Ship Command is not a bonus modular set where Hope Summers is. The Ship Command modular, I would say, is a full modular set because there are 6 cards you're putting in the encounter deck. That is a decent amount, and you're going to draw them as your encounter cards, semi-frequently, and that's going to impact the game. And this is where Ship Command becomes really good for the player, because all of these encounter cards have the ability to, exhaust the Milano instead of getting the negative effect. To some extent, Rogue Vessel is just terrible in all circumstances. But what this means is that in multiplayer, in 3 and 4 player specifically, Ship Command isn't maybe as good as you would like, because let's say player 1 reveals Blindside, and you could exhaust the Milano rather than get stunned, but then somebody else might reveal Special Delivery, and now the villain is attacking them with an attack boost, and you can't exhaust the Milano a second time, you've already exhausted it. So in multiplayer, maybe be careful not to exhaust the Milano on the easier encounter cards in Ship Command, the ones that let you exhaust it or give you multiple choice. They're generally not that bad, and maybe save it in case Special Delivery or Rogue Vessel comes up. You do not want Rogue Vessel to be someone's encounter card and already have the Milano exhausted, because Rogue Vessel is incredibly annoying. On the whole, while that might sound scary, I still think the Milano in Ship Command is incredibly favorable to the player, especially in solo, and Hope Summers is also more impactful in solo because the scenarios scale per person, but these sort of setup modulars here don't. But nonetheless, very, very good, super useful. You can include either one depending on which one you think will help you the most or be more fun/thematic, or just include both of them. The other modulars we're talking about here that actively help you, kind of, are Longshot and Power Stone. Longshot is a bonus modular, but it is not a setup modular. And what it is, it's just an ally that goes into the encounter deck. That is the whole modular set. Do not include this as your only modular in a scenario unless you're messing around. Really, this is not a proper, modular set, but nonetheless, it's a nice bonus. When he is revealed, you get an ally to help you. The thing is, what if he's a boost card or discarded somehow, or on the bottom of the deck and you don't actually see him before you win or lose the game? Long story short, long shot is a bit of a long shot. He's not reliable, but he's a nice bonus when he happens. Add him if you want the chance of some help, but don't count on him to actively, save the day. Power Stone is really weird. It starts on the villain, it gives them a boost to forwarding and attack, so how is this helping the player? Well, if you punch the villain in the face, if you deal 3 or more damage, you get to take the Power Stone, and now you have the stat boosts. This is really good, especially if you're a Radiant character who can use your stats multiple times, but it's also really good if you have included Hope Summers as well. You've got 2 bonus modulars in here, 2 setup modulars as well, and now, because you're getting the stat boost, so is Hope Summers. So you can kind of do a little bit of a combo there to help yourself out. The problem lies in that if you can't get this off the villain in good time, or, things go out of control, they get to have it for a few turns, it can start to actually hurt you quite a bit. So it's not purely beneficial, but it is mostly beneficial because between, blocking with allies, stuns, toughs, that kind of thing, other players, if you're in multiplayer, generally the players have many more tools to keep the Power Stone where the villain doesn't. So it's typically, again, in the player's favor and can be very, very helpful. I would include this, like I say, maybe from a Radiant character trying to do something weird, but it's a little bit weird, so I wouldn't consider adding this as much as I would the sort of Ship Command or Hope Summers. Those are the main ones to make the game easier. I did not have a good category for Streets of Mayhem. It makes the game different, kind of weird. It's kind of interesting how this works. This is not a setup modular, but I would consider it a bonus modular. It has 4 cards on it, which is sort of pushing the limit of what, a bonus could be, because that's a decent sort of chunk added to the encounter deck. But the thing is, they all have Surge. So if they are revealed as your encounter card, they kind of do their thing, they get put into player's environment, and then you get another encounter card. So you'd still see the encounter card you would have seen if these weren't in here. The bit where it's a little different is, if they are your boost card, then they are having that kind of effect, but it's not too big of a deal in my opinion. And yeah, these are really, really fun, really weird. So these kind of work a bit like Storm's weather supports if you're familiar with those, or the main schemes in the mansion attack scenario, because they give all the characters on the board some kind of weird effect. So it could be every character, villain, minions, allies, and heroes get +1 attack. That's pretty crazy. Or it could be each hero and ally gets +1 fort, while the enemies get an acceleration icon. That's kind of weird. So, you're getting more forwarding, but there's more threat to deal with. Do these things even out? Well, I would generally say the players, between allies and raiding, get a lot more attacks and forwarding in than the villains do get attacks and, use acceleration icons. So the first 2 we just looked at, I would say are generally in the player's favor, but not always, because sometimes the villain will just have that 1 extra attack and that'll be enough to finish you off, especially if there's some overkill or some weird kind of synergy going on with, their attack stat like Juggernaut, who gets, cards which deal damage equal to his attack. That could just end the game where it might not have before. So they're not strictly always in the player's favor, and that's why it's a little bit hard to rate here. It makes things a bit weird. It's not strictly easier or more difficult. It's more unpredictable, and that can be fun because once one of these is revealed and it's in play, great. But when another one is revealed, it doesn't go into play as well. It kind of replaces the previous one. So having to adapt to a changing scenario when you're including this mod set, which is the coolest thing. And in a similar kind of fashion, Sewer Tunnels and Warehouse District, which adds Retaliate to all characters or Steady to all characters respectively, I think these are typically more in the villain's favor because, if you're attacking more, and that's why the attack boost is good, well then you're going to be eating more Retaliate than the villain would because you're attacking them so much. My advice of when you should maybe include this is simply just when you want to change things up and have a scenario where you have to adapt and change tactics a little bit or reevaluate certain values in the middle. I think that's really fun. Just throw in any scenario, change it up, and you'll have a lot of fun with it, I'm sure. So these are the setup modulars that sort of are involved in the Dark Beast scenario: Blue Moon, Genosha, and Savage Land. These are full modular sets, not bonus modular sets, because they have 7 encounter cards that go into the encounter deck, and I really like these, but they are somewhat misleading. The special ability on each of these, which is triggered when the sort of encounter card tells you it's triggered, they don't go off as often as you would think, because you actually need to draw the right encounter card for it to happen, and you could, potentially go 4 or 5 turns in a row, and it won't happen at all. But not only that, some of the encounter cards say, do this thing, and if you can't do this thing, then do the special effect, or the special effect will happen when this condition is met. And that means even if you get the right encounter card to trigger the specials, they still might not trigger. The Savage Land triggers the most, it's the most reliable, with Blue Area of the Moon triggering the least. But it is interesting that these should be taken into account when you're judging whether to use these, but they're not a huge deal. What is a huge deal are the sort of passive effects, the first sentence on them below setup, and the encounter cards they come with. Blue Air of the Moon gives every minion guard. If you're just clearing minions, as most decks tend to do in most circumstances, so you might not notice a difference. This hurts rush decks the most. Otherwise, it's going to hurt more when you're ready to finish the villain off. Maybe, okay, I'll ignore minions for this turn, maybe the next turn, and just focus on villain damage, finish them off. And you can't, you have to get through the extra minions, which is pretty cool. Generally, it's just going to slow you down a little bit, particularly if you rush. The minions are a little bit similar. They will stun, confuse, exhaust you, so they're kind of slowing you down. Generally, this is a good mod set to include if you want to make sort of fragile villains last a bit longer, or if you want to slow down one of your rush decks and give it more of a challenge. Genosha will trigger special a little bit, and it has some cards that make you go Ultra Ego or suffer the consequences, so on and so forth. So it does have a little bit of threat pressure, but the main thing here is the steady. And that means if you're playing a stun/confuse heavy deck, it's going to suffer. Now, this is in a weird spot for me, because if I'm playing a stun heavy deck, I'm not really going to want to give the villain steady. That kind of seems counterintuitive. So I like this in decks that want to maybe use stuns and confuses, but not rely on them. The Savage Land is kind of the more generally applicable one of these, I would say. The villain gains Retaliate. Doesn't matter what kind of deck you're running, that's always going to have an effect. Retaliate will punish decks that have a lot more allies sort of attacking or readying up to attack, because, lots of small chunks of damage means more chunks of Retaliate coming back at you. But on the whole, not terrible. A bit more punishing for low HP characters as well. And the special can be quite disruptive. So if you have a really sort of technical deck that you need all the pieces to come together, and whoops, those crazy dinosaurs just made you discard another 3 cards and that combo piece is gone, it can be a little bit tricky, but it can be fun as well. So it depends what you're looking for. So generally, I would add Blue Moon if I want to make a rush deck have more of a challenge, or I want to give a low HP villain a bit more of a fighting chance to stick around and get some stuff done. Genosha is kind of something, like I said, I would like to punish, maybe heroes that have a lot more stun or confuse that don't necessarily need it to do well, or decks that are kind of, have a little bit of stun and confuse that I want to challenge a bit more. And the Savage Land is going to punish allies and readying builds more than others, but it's kind of generally applicable. These sets are a little bit hard to rate for difficulty, because if you don't bring any stun or confuse in your deck, Genosha's not really doing much, so on and so forth. But they're not terribly difficult, but they are a decent little challenge. So they're kind of an interesting place where if you want to sort of make sure you have a good fight on your hands, but aren't, overwhelmingly crushed, these are a good kind of place for that. So there are 2 side scheme sort of setup modular sets, and these are not bonus sets. They have a proper amount of encounter cards in. The first one is Infinites. So we have Gene Pool, which is the setup card, and it says after an ally is defeated by anything other than consequential damage, place 3 threat here. So basically, it punishes chump blocking. That is the primary way that it is punishing you. Gene Pool on its own doesn't really do anything with threat on it, but it does power up the Infinite Soldiers, and there'll be a bunch of these floating around the encounter deck, and if the threat is kept low on Gene Pool, these are ultra easy, ridiculously easy encounter cards in my opinion. But if there is threat on Gene Pool, these can be pretty soul crushing, 6 health, quick strike, and guard, and it's going to surge into something else. That surge really just pushes it over the edge. This kind of puts Infinites in a weird place for me, where it really punishes chump blocking, but if I have, stuns, toughs, or a good defense stat, Gene Pool and the Infinites, super easy, ridiculously easy. So it varies so much. So a little bit like with Genosha, this is a modular set where I think it is at its best, it shines the brightest, where you want a balance of things where, yeah, okay, maybe I want to block with allies a few times with this deck, I could expect to do that, but not every single turn. Maybe I've got some other means to deal with attacks a bit in the deck. Maybe the hero has a defense card, so on and so forth. Long story short, I like it when there's a balance and it's not overly punishing you for the one thing, but it does make you reevaluate that one thing that was a little bit too good, perhaps, which is, blocking with allies. Clan Akaba is a very different modular set. So whereas you'd add Infinites if you wanted to, punish chump blocking a bit, what you'd do with Clan Akaba is you'd add it in if you want to deal with more threat removal, and that might sound a bit weird, but if you're playing just this in solo, it's very easy to bring too much threat removal, and you could alter your deck, or you could include this modular set, and now you've got a side scheme that starts in play with a bunch of threat, and a bunch of encounter cards and their boost effects are going to start trying to add threat onto it. And there is kind of a downside for both of these side scheme modular sets, that if you play on Expert, Master Plan kind of gets a little bit of a nerf, I'd say. I'd say it's generally less punishing to add threat to these than to get a whole new side scheme, but there are some exceptions. If this gets sent over the edge by Master Plan in a multiplayer, what Ancient Ritual does is every player gets an encounter card if it reaches 10 threat, and that's a huge downside, like I said, in multiplayer. In solo, it's not the worst thing, it will vary with scenario, but it's generally still, desirable to be avoided anyway. Overall, I'd say the difficulty for Clan Akaba is pretty steady, while the infinites varies based on how you want to defend frequently, and it's a little bit challenging, but again, it's not overwhelmingly challenging. So I think most people get pretty good use out of this in most scenarios. It is of course not only good for Justice in solo, you can include it wherever you want to have a little bit more threat pressure. For example, if I'm playing Sandman in 2-player, 3-player, it doesn't really matter. He is not very difficult to deal with threat, and so this can kind of introduce the element of the game a bit, give the Justice player or, people's hero cards, just a little bit more to do in that regard. Here's what you've been waiting for, the superpower modular sets that came in the Mr. Sinister scenario in Next Evolution, and we'll talk about the Infinity Gauntlet shortly as well. For the superpower mod sets, I think these kind of walk the line between being bonus mod sets and normal mod sets because they have 4 cards in them, which is a little bit lower than you would expect. But, some mod sets that you're recommended to add only have, 5 or 6 anyway, so it's kind of there. But I would say generally, because of the effects are so interesting, but they're not enough to substantially fill out everything every scenario needs, you can use these as bonus modulars. That's how I most commonly use these. The encounter cards generally aren't too bad. Telepathy, which we'll look at in a second, does have a couple of overkill boost effects on there, which is kind of scary. Flight has a couple of piercing ones, so there's things you need to watch out for. Super Strength can give the villain +3 on an attack, which is kind of scary as well. But for the most part, they are pretty steady going. So Super Strength gives the villain steady. Everything I said about Genosha applies here. If you are running a stun lock deck, it's kind of weird to give the villain steady, but at the same time, if you've got a few stuns and confuse in your deck, and you kind of want to maybe just make things a little bit harder for yourself, you can throw this in there, and that works really, really well. Flight gives the villain overkill, which is very, very punishing if you're not prepared for it. But if you are prepared for it, actually pretty easy as well, because Super Strength is what gives steady. Flight does not give steady. If you just give the villain Flight and they otherwise do not have steady or Stalwart, you can just stun lock them and not even worry about the overkill for most turns in a solo game, and even a lot of 2-player games, because you can just avoid this by going Alter Ego, and you could alternate. There are strategies against it. It's very interesting, but on the whole, again, I think this kind of rewards a sort of mixed deck, because if you never want to block with allies, you're never going to really suffer the overkill too much here. It's just a +1 attack to the villain mod set, which is still pretty considerable from both of these in a lot of circumstances. But generally, I like this in scenarios where I've got some way in my deck or, with my hero to deal with attacks, but it won't be guaranteed all the time. So I am going to be taking some overkill damage or just, letting more things hit me in the face than I would like otherwise, and that will add pressure. So pretty scary mod set, but yeah, either of these are really good to make scenarios harder. Just keep in mind what deck you are running, because you could be punished really hard or barely at all, depending on what kind of deck you have. Much like Savage Land, the Retaliate on Telepathy, I think, makes it the most generally applicable superpower mod set of the 3 to add, because no matter what kind of deck you have, it's going to punish you in some way, but it's not going to be overly punishing. However, if you use allies a lot, if you use, readying up to attack a lot, yeah, it's going to punish you a little bit more. More chunks of damage, again, more small chunks of Retaliate coming back at you. It does give +1 scheme as well, which is particularly dangerous, especially in solo play, but it is there to make the scenario more difficult, so you have been warned. I think this is a really good mod set. It generally punishes allies a lot with the encounter cards as well, so if you lean into allies, it definitely has the scariest encounter cards of all the superpower mod sets. Then we have Infinity Gauntlet, and I love this mod set. What's really cool about these bonus modulars, and Infinity Gauntlet definitely is a bonus modular, no encounter cards go into the encounter deck. Definitely make sure you put in another modular set along with Infinity Gauntlet. What is really cool is that they kind of work alongside whatever the villain is otherwise doing. If you include a hard normal modular set, not a setup modular set, into a scenario, sometimes the sort of modular cards that come with it can feel like they overshadow what the villain is doing. It's like, the real threat is this kind of weird cards we've got on the side that don't kind of synergize perfectly with the scenario. Whereas with things like Infinity Gauntlet and Telepathy, it slows you down a bit. It gives you less resources to deal with what the villain is doing on their cards. So in some way, these attachments, these bonus modular sets are giving you less to work with to deal with the villain's encounter cards, which makes the villain's encounter cards scarier, if that makes sense. So the Infinity Gauntlet is trying to do multiple things. On one hand, yes, it's giving a stat boost, +1 scheme, +1 attack. That's pretty scary. But at the same time, it's got the Infinity Stones. We have the Time Stone and Space Stone, which are kind of trying to push ahead what the villain wants to do more. It's completing the main scheme more with the Time Stone, whereas bringing in a minion from the encounter deck with the Space Stone, and it will immediately attack if the villain attacked and, triggered this, in the start of the villain phase. So that's pretty scary. And what I really like is that the Time Stone is affecting the main scheme already in that scenario, and Space Stone is going to use a minion already in that scenario. And it could be from a mod set you added, but nonetheless, it's interacting with the encounter deck rather than adding new stuff to the encounter deck. And that's really fun. And these can add a lot of pressure. Then we've got, the Power Stone, Mind Stone. They, stun and confuse. You've got the Soul Stone, which heals. Reality Stone, which strips away your upgrades. These things are all slowing you down, giving you less resources left over to deal with the villain stuff, which is really, really a good way to do it, I think, because they feel, fun in my opinion. Okay, early Reality Stone undoing your excellent turn 1 setup does feel a little bit bad, but, these are here to make things harder. The villain doesn't get to put a bunch of upgrades in play early, and now sometimes neither do you. The big downside from Infinity Gauntlet is if you are running a stun-heavy deck, you can just stun the villain, and you might not really see the Infinity Gauntlet go off very much across an entire game. So, it is what it is. In a solo game, it's triggering every other turn at best in most cases because, it has to attack, put out the Infinity Stone, then, activate again, and the Infinity Stone, its effect will trigger. That's kind of how it works. So where would I use the Infinity Gauntlet? And for my money, I use it in kind of the, the lower, sort of weaker villains in the game to kind of boost them up. And I think you can use it pretty generally across most of them. I actually just recently did a villain ranking, and just in a general sense for me, I'm slapping Infinity Gauntlet and actually also all of these superpower mod sets as well that we just looked at onto villains that fall in the bottom 3 tiers to really help bring them up consistently to a level that's a little bit more challenging for me as someone who's played through the game, a ridiculous amount. Now, if you're a newer player, you probably don't want to do that, but it is interesting that you have these options beyond just toggling, standard and expert and so on. That really concludes the video. We've looked at making these scenarios easier, primarily with Hope Summers and the Milano from Ship Command. We've looked at kind of things around the middle. We've got, Streets of Mayhem, and we've actually got the sort of setup modulars from Dark Beast, like Savage Land. And then we've got the superpower stuff and Infinity Gauntlet to make things really a lot more difficult. Hopefully this has been useful to talk about. Most of these, like I say, are bonus modulars, not the Savage Land and stuff like that. Look at the amount of cards that come with it. Look at how much goes into the encounter deck. If 6 or more cards go into the encounter deck, consider that a full modular. If 4 go in, maybe it could be. Have a little think about it, see if it's the only modular set in there or not, because you want to make sure you've got some minions in most scenarios and so on and so forth, but they can be bonus modular sets. Anything adding 1 or 2 cards or, something that always surges like Streets of Mayhem, they are definitely bonus modular sets, and you definitely want to make sure they're layered on top of normal modular set choices. So I've been Villain Fury. If you want to like, comment, or subscribe, really appreciate it. Anything that makes YouTube happy makes me happy. Hopefully I'll see you guys in the next video, and I hope you have a great time trying some of these setup modular sets. Bye.